Hello, folks. We're back again for a tech talk. It's been a little while since we did a TradiePad tech talk, but I'm not by myself today. I've been joined by none other than our delivery manager, Ray. Hello, Ray.
Hey folks, hello.
It's good to be back doing a tech talk. As everybody knows, we love education, and this is definitely an educational subject that we're going to be talking about today. Something that we have had a lot of our clients ask us about and are interested in, which is customer asset management, or equipment management, or assets, depending on which system you're using. But essentially, it's the management of customer owned equipment or assets, or machines or whatever it is that they have that you as a business need to help look after and maintain or replace. And it's I guess a whole nother layer of data information that you can start capturing for your clients. So Ray, what's some examples of some of our customers that use asset management?
We've got businesses like plumbers, wastewater management, aircon, HVAC, a lot of aircon HVAC actually, fire services, smoke alarms, refrigeration servicing companies, lots of different kinds of businesses use customer asset management and need customer asset management in their workflow. So applies to a lot of different businesses.
Absolutely. And it really ties in tightly with what we do with the job management systems, because it's data and information about your customer, but it ties in with jobs, because you start to collect this information about the customer's pumps or their air conditioning systems, and then you're getting called out to maintain them, or it might be a break fix call out. It really ties in with the whole job management piece, and we're going to talk about, I guess, past methods of how people used to do this and some of the limitations that people would be up against. But it definitely ties in really tightly with the job management systems. And there's a number of job management systems that offer asset management as a component or a module. Not all of them. There's a lot of them that don't have it. And so it is sometimes a real differentiator or a decision maker on whether a piece of software is going to be the right fit for a business. But it typically comes as, I guess, a bit of an extra or an add-on for some people as well that haven't done it before and haven't thought about it before. But then when you think about it for your business, it actually becomes a service that you can offer your customers. And sometimes it's a value add, sometimes it can generate work. So we're kind of going to talk about all those pros and cons. But I think it is important to also talk about the difference between customer asset management versus internal plant and equipment management. So if you've got excavators or machines or tools that you need to manage for your business, that's a different function. But sometimes it can be used, or you can manage that through the use of the customer asset management function, which we'll talk about as well. But there is software out there that is aimed specifically at internal plant and equipment management or internal tool management, which we'll keep for a separate discussion. But it is important to highlight the difference between customer assets versus internal assets or internal plant equipment. And I guess it's really important as well to highlight that we're going to talk about a bunch of software products today. We'll throw some names out there and talk about them. But like anything, it's important that you, I guess, make the right decision on which system is going to be right for you. They're all great. They're all great bits of software, but there's, I guess, a lot that goes into making a decision on which one's right for you. And that's absolutely where we can help with helping make that decision and educating you on which one's going to work and which one's not. And of course, setting it up right and implementing it properly in the business and developing workflows around it, because it absolutely changes the way that jobs happen and can function, and the information that needs to be collected. So it's I guess that's where we fit into the picture of helping make the decision on which software is right, and then setting it up correctly and implementing it into the business. So today is really around education of what is asset management, why would you bother doing it, and what are the things you got to think about when you're going to implement it into the business. So Ray, we've both worked with customers in the past that have done a certain level of asset management. What have you seen out there and how people have done it in the past if they didn't have a system that could do it?
Probably one of the most prominent things that sticks out in my mind is the whole aircon HVAC area, where, typically businesses that are selling aircon units to customers, aircon units have warranties. So maintaining that system is part of upholding the warranty. So I've seen a lot of new implementations of aircon units where we need a service plan, and using the asset management system in different pieces of software allows you to typically implement that service plan so that a warranty is maintained. So that's kind of aside from any kind of reactive maintenance or servicing that happens against these assets. Um, but I've seen a lot of that.
And how have people managed it before they had a system?
Ooh, that's a good question. I guess a bit of a how long's a piece of string question, because there's lots of ways it could have been managed, but none of them quite match the efficiency and the elegance of doing it in an integrated job management system. But in the past, there's been, we see a lot of spreadsheets where assets are managed in spreadsheets, and spreadsheets are great to a point. Uh, one of the things from my past that always sticks out in my head about spreadsheets is I was learning about databases, and someone asked me what's the difference between a spreadsheet and a database. And a spreadsheet is totally unstructured. You can put a piece of data here, put a piece of data there, you can do whatever you want with it. Whereas databases are much more ordered. And job management systems use databases in the background, not spreadsheets. So when people are managing their assets through spreadsheets, number one, they can set up that spreadsheet however they like. There's no structure to it. So they're creating their own kind of structure, which kind of means that one spreadsheet is realistically hardly ever, if ever, like another spreadsheet. Whereas, when you compare databases, they're very similar because there's a structure and an order to them. So that's one way it's been managed in the past, through spreadsheets, and that gets a bit wild, shall we say.
And open to human error.
Yeah, open to human error and open to kind of interpretation. And spreadsheets create this ambiguity of data. And when you're working with data, ambiguity can be a positive in some instances, but usually it's a bit of a negative, especially if you need that data, to be some reliable source of truth for some other process, say. So spreadsheets are not the best way to manage it. They're a bit too flexible. There's too much flexibility. And then you got paper, of course, and paper's paper. So
We love getting rid of paper.
we can do a lot with paper, including throw it in the fire and burn it. So, paper's easily lost. It's not a great way to store any data that you want to retain. I mean, at one really basic level, if you don't lose paper, ink fades over time. So, that's just one shortcoming of paper, using paper to manage this kind of thing. But then typically, if we set aside paper and spreadsheets and move to systems, there are a number of systems out there that will do asset management, but they're not integrated or can't integrate into the job management workflow. So it kind of takes your asset management and plucks it out of the workflow and makes a separate thing out of it that we can't then integrate in a usable way with your job workflow.
Mm. So you might be making a database of the record of all the assets and test results, but it's in its own little,
Which is better than a spreadsheet.
yeah, yeah, but it's in its own little silo or bucket that's not then in the customer record in the job management system, or we've kind of got data silos starting to happen. And essentially you've got people having to use multiple apps to do things instead of just one app. And we see this quite often with tools like Monday.com or Trello, kind of Excel on steroids, those kinds of tools. There's some good forms systems that have asset functions in them. And that works well, but you're ending up with this silo of information that doesn't necessarily talk to other things.
That's exactly right. It's a massive step up from using a spreadsheet and eons away from using paper, but it's still not the best scenario because it is siloed. And when it's siloed, it means that, like Clinton mentioned, your staff may have to use different apps for different purposes. And that can be okay, but it can also be confusing for them. So, and it can create it can create scenarios where wrong data gets entered in the wrong place and all that kind of, business. So siloing data whilst putting the asset data in one of these systems is far better than a spreadsheet or paper. The fact that it's siloed or partitioned away from the job data itself creates its own set of issues. So ultimately, if we can integrate all of that data in the one place and have a database behind it, not a spreadsheet, then we're well ahead of the game in terms of integrating that into our workflow and making it more a useful kind of workflow.
And an all-in-one system. We'll always try and push the idea of keeping everything together in the one place. So all the customer information and the job information and all of that kind of record, try and keep it all in one place. There's always the accounting package that will have the financial data, but from a customer and a job perspective, we want to try and keep all that together in that one place. So it's easy to find it, and it's easy for the people that are having to collect the data and do the work in the field.
Yeah. And collecting data is one side of the equation, but the other side of the equation is, 6 months down the track when you want to find that data. How easy is it to map the asset back to the job or the customer? When it's siloed, that becomes way more of a headache than it needs to be.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess a big piece of this is being aware that it is a whole nother layer of information that you're collecting about a customer and about their stuff. And it's potentially more work in collecting that information and keeping it. So why would people bother? Why do they do this? What's the benefit of doing this asset management? What have you seen?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, there's, quite often there's other reasons why this data needs to be kept. It's not just a matter of keeping a service log for a piece of equipment, but, it may need to be proved that the piece of equipment has been serviced for a warranty fix. So there's a lot of advantage in keeping this data in the first place. And then keeping it integrated with the customer and the job means that looking up that data when the time comes, if the time comes, becomes, something we just do. It's a simple thing. It's not, a major effort to link up data between systems that don't really talk to each other. So the whole integrated data approach when it comes to asset management for those that need to log data about their asset or their customer's assets, it's really just about making everything more efficient and saving time and it also stems back to professionalism. I mean, it looks way more professional if a customer rings you and says, "Oh, what was the story with my asset on X date?" And you can just look it up and go, "Bang, here's the answer," rather than having to, give me 15 minutes and I'll call you back, kind of thing, while I go and look for it all.
That's feedback that I've heard from clients that have been using asset management for a while that were new to it. Is they from a customer service perspective, they say that they're able to give the client much better and richer information about their equipment, about their asset, and so they can I guess be proactive with it, saying, look, we've serviced this particular piece of equipment 5 times in the last 12 months. It's getting to a point where it's not economical to keep repairing it. You should be replacing it, and you've got all that history and data there to back that up. And from a customer's perspective, they don't keep that kind of information. So if you can be providing that to them and you're that trusted source that they go to, then you're going to keep being their preferred supplier. You're going to keep getting their work. You've got that data layer that they don't necessarily have. It makes you quite sticky to them as a customer. It might be a facility management company. It might be a strata company where you've got to look after a building. So it's kind of really tying you into that client and that property. And it's another layer of customer service that a lot of others that don't do asset management can't provide. So it's customer level. It can be generating work. So talking before about kind of regular maintenance scheduling, and being able to set up a recurring job sequence to say, okay, we service this particular piece of equipment once a quarter or once every 6 months, and with the right system, it can just do all that automatically. So it's actually generating work for you off the back of the asset information. So that's probably the most positive feedback that I've heard from clients.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
So when someone's looking at at wanting to bring asset management into the mix for their business and they haven't done it before, what are some things you can think of that need to be considered?
Oh, there's a bunch of things that we need to think about. Um, how we create the assets. Do we have an existing database? Do we need to pull that data into the system? And if so, how are we going to get that data into the system? Um, some systems have mobile apps that are capable of adding a new piece of equipment. So that's a consideration. But overall, how we create the assets in the system, what information is kept about the asset? Is it just storing, the name and model number? Is it storing more? Does it store the location? And again, how accurate is that location? And how much does that matter to you? So the information about the asset is super important. How we identify the asset. So typically it's done these days through a QR or barcode. And the main difference between those two is a barcode is quite, I guess, basic level. It's a bit old school. A QR code is a fair bit more advanced and can hold more data about an asset or anything that you put into the QR code. So that's a consideration about identifying it.
And those three, I'll jump in there. Those three pieces are, I guess, fundamental components of the asset management system. And when we think about the different software that we work with that has asset management capability, at the, I guess, the entry level or the basic level would be ServiceMate. And then as we go into more capable, more complex systems that have asset management, we kind of go to the opposite end of the spectrum, where you've got a Scorer, Aeroflow, Simpro. Those three components are quite different in the way the assets are created, the type of information that can be collected, and how the assets are identified. That varies greatly between those range of systems that I just mentioned. And so they're all great software and they all can do asset management, but it's quite different between all of them. So ServiceMate is quite basic and entry level, has some kind of unique capabilities, but when you compare it to the capability of the asset management in Simpro or in Aeroflow or a Scorer, it's quite different.
I guess at a high level, ServiceMate or your more entry level systems tend to be a bit more rigid in how we create, identify, and what information we store about the asset. And then as you move up the, hierarchy of software to the Aeroflows and the Simpros and the Scorers, you get a bit more flexibility in how you can approach these things. That tends to be the kind of way it goes.
And sometimes a bit more complexity.
The increased flexibility of the more advanced systems does tend to increase complexity. And that's where, without a bit of guidance, it can be easy to get yourself tied up in knots, or, just start logging the wrong data, which potentially is even worse. So especially with your more complex systems, having a bit of guidance in the setup and implementation of that system can really go a long way in terms of you and your team getting the most out of an asset management system.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I remember a case where we had a client come to us that wanted to implement ServiceMate's asset management into their business. It was a rather large organization, and they'd made assumptions around how ServiceMate would work for them and how they would take their existing list of assets, which were in a spreadsheet, and how all that would get created. We're talking about thousands of assets that they had. And they're like, okay, we want to do it in ServiceMate. But the way that ServiceMate assets are created and the type of data that can be collected about them, it was not practical for them. And so in theory, it was going to work, but the practical side of it, of how they would actually get created and how they would get managed, it wasn't until we dug into how that actually would function for them that they're like, oh, this isn't going to work. And so sometimes it requires that little bit of a deep dive or investigation to go, okay, well, Here's how it's actually going to function for you. And it's similar with, we talk to clients about inventory management. In people's minds, they want to be able to track inventory and stock and know how much is on Bill's truck and how much is on Bob's truck. But the practical implementation and management of that, it's a lot of times it just doesn't work for people. So it's the same thing with asset management. It's got to be practical.
Yeah, totally. And on that note, the way software companies tend to market their products, they use high level statements about what their product's capabilities are. And when you talk about assumptions, anyone can read that high level comment and automatically make 15 assumptions in their head. And those assumptions can sometimes be right, but realistically, when it comes to software, the devil is always in the detail. And that's where you know whether or not the system is useful and usable and practical for your particular business, as opposed to, what a software company may say at a higher level. That sounds really glossy and nice, but when you look at it in detail, it's like, actually, it's not quite what I thought it was. So assumption can really work against you when you're working with these kinds of things, and you really do need to look at the detail and just how these things actually play out in the system to know that, it's actually going to work for your business.
A good example of that would be some of the systems have recurring maintenance schedulers, maintenance planner or maintenance scheduler that can automatically create all the jobs, which is like a magic wand. And everyone loves a good magic wand, but there's a bit of detail to think about with that on, well, when the jobs get created, what happens? Are they just created and scheduled? Do we need to contact the client, say, hey, are we going to come out and do your work? Who are they being assigned to? Do they need to go into like a scheduling queue? So there's a whole bit of workflow there, but that function, that recurring maintenance planner or scheduler, is a really important part of asset management that can help automate the creation of jobs and make sure things don't get missed. But we had a client recently where it wasn't necessarily doing it the way they expected it to be doing it. And so it's that whole kind of workflow and change management that we've got to think about as well.
Yeah. So coming back to considerations when you select a system, scheduling is one of them. You just raised that. And, again, some systems will just do your recurring jobs and that's it. But other systems will give you the option of doing a recurring job and setting it up automatically, or approaching it manually, so that you do have a point in time where you can contact the customer and say, hey, your 6 monthly service is due next week. Do you want to have it, or do you want to skip this one? So, again, that's system dependent. Some systems will give you that little option, and others won't. How you capture the data, that's another consideration when selecting a system. So, some, again, will, you always capture it this fixed way through the mobile app or whatever it may be. Others may give you more flexibility. You can capture it through a mobile app. You can import a spreadsheet of data if you've got existing assets. So how the data is captured and is an important consideration. And then, of course, how you report on it. So you're reporting on one asset, all of the customer's assets, and what happens if we detect a failure in one of our tests, when we're doing a service. Does that then push that piece of equipment automatically through to a new quote for you, for example, so that you've got that set up and you don't have to do it manually? Or is it just leaving it and, it's registering the fail against the equipment, and then you're left to go and build a quote wholly manually? So there's little considerations like that, or big considerations like that, throughout the whole kind of asset workflow that need to be taken into consideration when you are selecting a piece of software.
Yeah. And think about how it's going to play into your workflow, and how your field team, who are typically the ones that are collecting the data, they're the ones that are doing the tests and getting the results. How are they going to capture that, and how practical is that? Sometimes there might be testing equipment that we need to think about. So quite often in pool industry in particular, they'll have water testers, and some of those water testers can be integrated into systems where test results via Bluetooth can feed into the system and they can go into the job or whatever. So sometimes there's that whole kind of external equipment piece that's got to be considered, as well as how do we get the information from the external equipment into the system. So lots and lots of things to consider. And I mentioned it before about internal plant and equipment, so internal tools, and we have a number of clients that are using the customer asset management as a bit of a workaround to manage internal equipment like vehicles or machines or whatever. It's not necessarily designed for it, but quite often there's a little workaround there where they are not necessarily customer owned, but you set yourself up as a customer in the system, and then you've got all your assets there, and you can keep a record of any servicing and maintenance that you've done. So a bit of a workaround, but it works for a lot of businesses.
In fact, we have some businesses that are using customer asset components in their system solely to manage their internal equipment and not for use for customer equipment at all. So yeah, it can be used that way if need be.
We're good at breaking the rules, Ray.
Yes, we like breaking rules.
You need to know the rules before you can break them.
Exactly.
And what about downsides? What are the downsides of asset management that people need to think about? It's not all roses.
No, and probably the most common one is it's another thing that we need to manage. So what does that mean? That means your staff need to add more data. So, they're punching more data into whatever system it may be, whether it be through their website or through the mobile app of the system. There's just an extra layer of data that needs to be maintained. So that's a consideration. It needs to be maintained, it needs to be entered in the first place. And probably overarching all of that, and this is a common kind of downside or consideration, I'd say. It's probably not more a consideration than a downside, but it's a pretty common consideration with a number of components in job management systems. And one could probably argue just in using a job management system at all, and that's it requires commitment and discipline. So there's an old saying in IT, if you put shit into a system, you get shit out of it. And I love that. It's so simple and so true.
And so eloquent.
Yes, yes. It just hits the nail on the head. But obviously you need to have the right data in the system. And if people are flaking out and not putting all of the data in, then you're never going to get all of the data out because it was never in there in the first place. So commitment and discipline are probably the most important overarching things that we need to foster in a team. And I guess when you're implementing software, a big part of that is ensuring that, any resistance to any of the system, whether it be the asset component or any other components, is dealt with and tamed, I guess, ASAP, because it's that kind of resistance that leads to that kind of flaky data entry quite often. So long as everyone's on board with it all, and everyone's invested in it all, you typically get a good run out of this. But yeah, they're the main considerations. We've got another thing to manage. We've got more data entry, and it does require commitment and discipline to get the right data in and then the right reporting out the other end.
Yeah. Yeah. So a few downsides or considerations, like you mentioned, but overall, if you've got any customers that have equipment or assets that you're looking after and maintaining, asset management can be a massive benefit.
Yeah. And if we compare those downsides to the downsides of using some other method to log your assets, like paper or spreadsheets, you're going to find there's way more downsides with either of those options than with using some kind of integrated job management system that has an asset functionality built into it, just because of the nature of it. So yes, they're downsides, but they're relatively minor compared to the alternatives.
So just a little bit more on the asset information. We mentioned QR codes and barcodes that can be used to identify an asset. Some systems will provide you with those QR codes, like ServiceMate. So they give you some QR codes with stickers that you can use. You have to use theirs. You don't have the option of using your own, but a lot of the others, they have a barcode function or a QR code function, but you need to produce them. And then that barcode or QR code is then used to identify that particular asset and gets linked to that asset. So you need to be able to create the QR codes or the barcodes in the first place. And then a lot of people will want labels to go onto their actual assets. And so we've got we've got some partners that we work with that can actually produce those labels. They can produce the either on metal or on a sticker. They can have your logos and branding on them. So they can actually produce the actual labels themselves. I've got an example of a couple of them here. So you can see there's a whole different bunch of options with layouts and formatting and QR codes or barcodes and materials. So that's a consideration as well, as how are we going to produce these? How are we going to use them? A lot of times it becomes a marketing. It can become a marketing tool as well, because it can have your logo. And if a person that's outside of your organization scans the QR code or the barcode, we can even have that kind of directing them to your website as an option. So a little bit to consider there on how that part of the asset management and functionality is going to work. So if you need a hand with anything to do with assets, or you have a system that doesn't have asset capability and you want to look at something that does, we're absolutely here to help. We're the specialists in this area. So feel free to reach out to us. We can help you get the most out of your existing system, or help you move to another system, or just getting started with a conversation. So feel free to reach out. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.